Kody Brown is a grandfather, many times over. Across his 18 children, a whole third generation of this family has been arriving, little ones who represent the future of the Brown line. And here's the quiet, aching question almost nobody is asking. Where is he in their lives? Because if a man has grown distant from many of his adult children, that distance doesn't just stop with them. It rolls downhill. It reaches the grandchildren too. Kids who may grow up barely knowing the patriarch whose name and whose show defined their parents' entire childhoods. So tonight, I want to talk about the forgotten third generation, the Brown grandchildren, and what their relationship, or lack of one, with Cody reveals about the true cost of how this family came apart. Let me start with the simple math of it, because it sets the stage. With 18 children, many now grown and partnered, the number of grandchildren has been steadily climbing for years. This is no longer just a family of Cody, 4 wives, and their kids. It's a sprawling, multi-generational clan, with a whole cohort of young children who are Cody's grandkids. On paper, that should be a picture of legacy, of a patriarch surrounded by a growing dynasty, of holidays packed with little ones calling him grandpa. That's the version of this story that could have been. And the gap between that version and the reality is exactly what we need to talk about. Because the reality, by every visible sign, is distance. We've documented at length on this channel how many of Cody's adult children have drifted away from him. Some are openly estranged. Some are simply quietly distant. And here's the thing about estrangement. It's not contained to the person who's estranged. When an adult child pulls away from a parent, that child's own children naturally end up at a distance from that grandparent too. You can't have a close relationship with the kids of someone you barely speak to. So the fractures in the second generation become, almost automatically, fractures in the third. The grandchildren inherit the distance their parents created, or that was created for them before they were old enough to have any say in it. Think about what that actually means day to day for these kids. There are likely Brown grandchildren growing up who see their grandfather rarely, if at all, who doesn't have the kind of relationship with him that grandkids in close families take for granted. The regular visits, the inside jokes, the sense of a grandparent as a fixture in your life. For these children, Cody may be more of a concept than a presence. A man they know is their grandfather in the abstract, a figure from a TV show their parents were on, rather than someone woven into the fabric of their actual childhoods. And that's a quiet kind of loss, one that the kids themselves may not even fully register until they're older and realize what other families had that they didn't. Now, let me be careful and fair, because this is delicate territory, and I'm not going to invent specifics about private children. I don't know the precise details of Cody's relationship with each grandchild. Some of those relationships may be warmer than the general pattern suggests. There may be branches of the family where the grandkids do see him. I'm not claiming total estrangement across the board, because I can't verify that, and it wouldn't be fair to assert it. What I'm pointing to is the broad, logical pattern that distance in the second generation tends to produce distance in the third, and that for at least some of these grandchildren, the relationship with Cody is likely thin or absent. That's a reasonable read of the situation, offered as a read, not as a claim about any specific child. Let me talk about why this is such a poignant dimension of the family's story, because I think it adds a real layer of sadness. The losses we usually discuss, the wives leaving, the adult kids distancing, those involve people who had agency, who made choices, who participated in the conflict. The grandchildren didn't. They're completely innocent in all of this. They didn't choose plural marriage. They didn't choose the divorces. They didn't choose the estrangements. And yet, they may be quietly paying a price for all of it, in the form of a grandfather they barely know. There's something especially sad about consequences landing on the people who had no part in causing them. The grandkids are the most blameless figures in this entire saga, and they may be among the ones who quietly lose the most. And let me flip it to Cody's side for a moment, because there's a real loss there too. Being a grandfather is, for many people, one of the great joys of later life. It's the second chance, the role where you get to enjoy the children without the heavy responsibility, where you get to be the fun, loving presence. To miss out on that, to be a grandfather many times over and yet largely on the outside of your grandchildren's lives, is a profound loss for the grandparent as well. If Cody is indeed distant from many of his grandkids, then he's missing one of life's deepest rewards. And whatever you think of how he got here, that's a genuinely sad thing for any human being to miss. The estrangement doesn't just cost the grandchildren a grandfather, it costs the grandfather his grandchildren. Let me connect this to the broader theme that runs through this entire family, the theme of choices and their long bills. Everything we've discussed about Cody, the favoritism, the way he handled the marriages, the self-centeredness, the failures of presence, all of it led to the adult children drifting away. And now we see that the bill for those choices didn't stop coming due when the kids grew up. It keeps arriving, in a new form, with each grandchild who grows up without him. The consequences of how you treat your children don't end with your children. They echo into the generations that follow. Cody's choices as a father are now, in a sense, being paid for in his diminished role as a grandfather. The ripple keeps rippling. There's a universal truth in this that I think gives the story its weight beyond the Browns. The relationships we build, or fail to build, with our children shape far more than just those relationships. They shape our access to everything that flows from our children, including grandchildren. A parent who maintains loving, connected relationships with their adult kids gets welcomed into the lives of the grandkids. A parent who lets those relationships fray often finds the door to the next generation quietly closing too. It's one of the less discussed consequences of family estrangement, that it compounds across generations. You don't just lose your child's closeness, you risk losing your place in a whole branch of the family tree that grows from them. That's a sobering thing for any parent to consider. I want to hold some space for the possibility of repair, though, because nothing here is necessarily permanent. Family relationships can change, estrangements can soften, and grandchildren can sometimes be the very thing that brings a fractured family back toward each other, because the arrival of a new generation has a way of reshuffling priorities and softening old grievances. It's not impossible to imagine a future where Cody, through genuine change and genuine effort, rebuilds enough with some of his adult children to be welcomed into his grandkids' lives. The door isn't necessarily locked forever, but, and this is the crucial part, that kind of repair requires the hard work of mending the second-generation relationships first. You can't reach the grandchildren without going back through their parents. The path to the grandkids runs straight through the kids he lost. And that brings us back to something we discussed in the context of Cody's apology tour. If Cody genuinely wants to be part of his grandchildren's lives, the way to get there isn't grand gestures or speeches, it's the slow, humble work of rebuilding trust with his adult children, expecting nothing over a long period of time. The grandkids are downstream of that work. Repair the relationship with the parent, and access to the grandchild may follow. Skip that work, and the distance simply persists into the next generation. So, in a strange way, the existence of all these grandchildren raises the stakes on everything else we've discussed. It's not just about whether Cody reconciles with his kids for their sake, it's about whether he wants any place at all in the generations still to come. So when I step back and look at the forgotten third generation, here's what I see. I see a growing number of grandchildren who, by the logic of the family's fractures, likely have thin or distant relationships with the grandfather whose name they carry. I see the most innocent people in this entire story quietly inheriting a distance they had no part in creating. I see a grandfather missing one of life's great joys as a consequence of choices made long before these children were born. And I see the deepest truth of this whole family laid bare one more time, that the bills for how we treat our children don't get paid once. They keep coming due, generation after generation, in the faces of the little ones who grow up wondering why Grandpa was never really there. Let me dwell on what grandparents actually provide, because naming it makes the loss concrete. A close grandparent is a particular kind of gift in a child's life. They're the link to where you came from, the keeper of family stories, the person who loves you with slightly less pressure than a parent does. They show up at the recitals and the games. They slip your treats. They tell you what your mom or dad was like as a kid. They give a child a sense of being part of something larger than just their household, a lineage, a history, a tribe. When a grandparent is absent or distant, a child misses all of that. Not in a dramatic, visible way, but in a quiet absence, a missing thread in the fabric of their belonging. For at least some of the Brown grandchildren, that thread to their grandfather may simply not be there. But here's something hopeful and important to say, because the kids are not without that kind of love. They have grandmothers. The wives, whatever their fractures with Kody, are by every appearance devoted to their children and grandchildren. Janelle, Christine, Meri, these are women who clearly love their families fiercely. So the Brown grandchildren are very likely surrounded by warm, present grandmotherly love, even if the grandfather is at a distance. And there are other figures stepping into those roles too. David Woolley, for instance, is now a step-grandfather figure in Christine's branch of the family. And given everything we've discussed about his steady, warm presence, those grandchildren may be getting exactly the kind of devoted older male presence in their lives, just not from Kody. So this isn't a story of children deprived of love. It's a story of children who have plenty of it, just rooted around the grandfather rather than through him. And honestly, that detail makes the story even more pointed for Kody, because it's not that the grandchildren are missing grandparental love in general, it's that they may be getting it from everyone except him. The grandmothers provide it, step-figures provide it. The family closes ranks and gives these kids the warmth they need, and Kody risks being the one notable absence in an otherwise loving picture. That's a particular kind of sad. It's one thing for a child to lack a grandparent because of distance or death that no one could control. It's another for a child to have a living grandfather who is simply, by the slow accumulation of choices and fractures, not really part of the picture, while everyone else shows up. The love isn't missing. He is. Let me point out something about how the show handles, or rather doesn't handle, this dimension. A program built on the image of family is not going to spend a lot of time highlighting a grandfather's absence from his grandchildren's lives. That's not the kind of footage that serves the franchise's preferred story. So the third-generation distance is exactly the sort of thing that happens in the gaps the cameras don't fill. We see the drama the show wants to show. We don't see the quiet Tuesday afternoons when a grandchild's life simply proceeds without a grandfather in it, because absence doesn't film well. It's not a scene, it's the lack of a scene. And that's precisely why it goes under-discussed, even though it may be one of the most significant long-term realities of this entire family. The most important things are often the ones too quiet to make the edit. I keep coming back to the question of legacy, because grandchildren are, in the most literal sense, a person's legacy. They're the future of the family line, the people who will carry memories and stories forward after the older generation is gone. And the relationship a grandparent builds with them shapes how that grandparent is remembered. The grandkids who grow up close to a grandparent carry that love forward, tell stories about them, keep them alive in memory. The grandkids who grow up distant carry something else. An absence, a question mark, a figure they never really knew. So the kind of relationship Kody builds, or fails to build, with these children isn't just about the present. It's about how he'll be remembered by the very people who will outlive him. Legacy isn't what you say about yourself. It's what your grandchildren remember. Let me return to the bridge idea because I think it's the most hopeful thread and it deserves more than a passing mention. There's a real phenomenon where grandchildren become the catalyst for healing in fractured families. Adult children who couldn't reconcile for their own sake sometimes soften when there are grandchildren involved because they want their kids to have a grandparent, or because the arrival of a new generation puts old grievances in perspective. The little ones can be the reason a family decides the estrangement isn't worth it anymore. So it's genuinely possible that these grandchildren could be the thing that eventually draws Kody and some of his adult children back toward each other. New life has a way of reordering what matters. The grandkids aren't just inheritors of the distance. They could, potentially, be the ones who help close it. But, and I keep having to say this because it's the crux, that possibility depends entirely on choices Kody hasn't visibly made yet. The grandchildren can be a bridge, but only if Kody is willing to walk across it. And walking across it means doing the humble, sustained work of repairing things with their parents first. A grandfather can't bypass estranged adult children to reach the grandkids directly. The relationship with the third generation is gated behind the relationship with the second. So all of this, once again, comes back to whether Kody is willing to do the actual work of change, not the performance of it. The grandchildren give him a powerful reason to. Whether that reason is enough to move him is the open question hanging over this whole family's future. And maybe that's the note to sit with as we wrap, because it reframes everything. We tend to think of estrangement as a story about the past, about old wounds and who did what to whom. But the existence of these grandchildren turns it into a story about the future. Every choice Kody makes now isn't just about settling accounts with his adult kids. It's about whether a whole generation of children will grow up knowing their grandfather or not. That's a future that's still being written, day by day, in the choices he makes or fails to make. The past is fixed. The grandchildren are not. And in that sense, the most innocent figures in this entire saga may also be the ones holding the family's last, best chance at something like redemption, if anyone is willing to reach for it. There's one more quiet truth worth naming before we go, and it's about how children understand absence. A young child doesn't experience a distant grandparent as a dramatic story of estrangement. They just experience a gap, a name that comes with no real memories attached, a grandfather who exists mostly in other people's stories rather than in their own. And as those children grow up, they slowly piece together why, absorbing the family's history in fragments, forming their own quiet conclusions about the man they barely knew. So Cody isn't just missing time with these kids now, he's shaping how an entire generation will come to understand him, not through what he says, but through his absence from their earliest memories. By the time they're old enough to ask why Grandpa was never around, the answer will already have been written, in all the ordinary days he wasn't there for. So I'll turn it over to you, because this one tends to hit people in a tender place. Do you think Cody will ever genuinely rebuild a place in his grandchildren's lives? Or do you think that door is quietly closing for good? And here's the bigger question for the comments. For those of you who've seen family estrangement ripple across generations in your own lives, does this pattern feel familiar? Tell me, because these are the conversations that go deeper than the drama, and I read every single comment. If you want me to do a thoughtful look at which branches of the family seem to be raising the next generation and what that means for the Brown legacy, let me know, and I'll build it with care. And if you appreciate that we treat the innocent members of this family, especially the children, with real gentleness, then do me a favor and subscribe, because compassion and honesty belong together, and that's exactly what we aim for here.